You are about to hear a story that your history teacher never told you. Not because it wasn't important, but because for decades it was classified. It is the story of a ghost army, a force of tens of thousands of soldiers that existed only on paper, in radio signals, and in the minds of the men who built it. It never fired a single shot, it never crossed the channel, it never landed on any beach, and yet it may have done more to win the Second World War than any real army that did. This is the story of how a collection of canvas, scaffolding poles, inflatable rubber, and one very convincing Spaniard held back two of Nazi Germany's most powerful armored divisions, at the exact moment when those divisions could have changed everything. If you think deception is a side story of World War II, stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand that deception was the story. Spring 1944. A German reconnaissance pilot is flying over the southeastern coast of England at 25,000 feet. He looks down and cannot believe what he sees. Stretched along the Thames estuary and the Kent coastline, rows upon rows of landing craft, supply depots stacked with fuel drums, administrative buildings, vehicle parks, field hospitals, the entire logistical apparatus of a full army group preparing to cross the channel. The pilot photographs everything. The photographs are developed, analyzed, passed upward through the intelligence chain to the staff officers whose assessments Field Marshal Erwin Rommel depends on to position his Panzer reserves. But here is where the story turns. Almost none of what that pilot had seen was real. This is the story of how a group of Hollywood set designers, civil engineers, theatrical prop builders, and signals officers constructed a fictional army so convincing that Adolf Hitler held back two Panzer divisions from the beaches of Normandy for 7 weeks after the actual landings had already begun. It is also the story of an operation so compartmentalized that the men building the fake landing craft in one field had no knowledge of the men transmitting fake radio traffic 3 miles away. Those men had no knowledge of the double agents in London whose reports were tying the entire deception together into something coherent enough to be believed by the Abwehr, German military intelligence at its highest levels. Remember, it was the deception component of a larger plan, Operation Overlord. Fortitude itself divided into 2 sub-operations. Fortitude North was designed to convince the German command that a substantial Allied force was preparing to invade Norway. Fortitude South of the larger, bolder effort, the one that would change the course of history. Its purpose was singular and precise, to convince the German High Command that the main Adhere landing would come not at Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais, the northest point of the English Channel, 150 miles to the northeast of the beaches where the real assault divisions would come ashore on the morning of June 6th. But how were they going to pull it off? The south of Fortitude South required the creation of an entirely fake other foot group. The formation was designated the First United States Army Group, FUSAG. It needed a commander whose name alone would make German intelligence take notice. They chose General George S. Patton, the man who had torn through German lines in North Africa and Sicily, whose offensive instincts the German staff had studied and feared for years. Patton outdoors a cross by German agents in Britain, nearly all of whom were, by that point, under British control, feeding back only what their MI5 handlers authorized them to transmit. Berlin read over your report and word. But of many of the supporting FUSAG's fictitions along the Kent of explosive lines were the product of the special means section of the London controlling section. The landing craft that appeared in aerial photographs were largely built from scaffolding poles, painted canvas, and wooden frames. It sounds absurd until you consider the view from 25,000 feet through a camera lens. At that altitude, a canvas landing craft moored in a tide estuary was, for the purposes of German photographic interpretation, functionally indistinguishable from of your one. By German reconnaissance had photographed and catalogued more than 250 of these outfits along the southeastern coastline alone.
And it did not stop there. Inflatable rubber tents were manufactured across Britain. Deflated, one weighed roughly 90 pounds, light enough for 2 men to carry. Fully inflated, it matched the dimensions of a real M4 Sherman within every tolerance a German photographic interpreter working from high-altitude imagery could measure. Teams deployed around these fake tanks developed specific protocols for creating realistic tread marks in the surrounding soft ground, because a convincing tank without surrounding track marks would raise suspicion. Every detail had been considered, every gap had been closed. The fake oil storage infrastructure near Dover was a separate effort entirely. The Germans knew that any major cross-channel operation would require enormous fuel reserves staged close to the embarkation ports. A convincing embarkation area with no visible fuel storage would have been conspicuous in its absence. So standard oil storage tank silhouettes were constructed from timber framing and corrugated metal sheeting, arranged in the dispersed pattern that real fuel installations used to minimize vulnerability to air attack. From above, it was perfect. But all of this visual deception was not enough on its own. The Germans had a sharper weapon: radio traffic analysis. FUSAG needed to sound like an army group. Real army groups generated enormous volumes of radio communication between their subordinate corps, divisions, and supporting units. German signals intelligence, operating under the designation Funkaufklärung, had developed considerable skill at traffic analysis, deriving order of battle information not from the content of encrypted messages, but from their volume, frequency, and call sign patterns. To satisfy this, British and American signals units in southeastern England transmitted continuous dummy traffic perfectly consistent with the communications pattern of a genuine multi-core formation. The Germans listened, they analyzed, and they concluded that what they were hearing was real. But the deepest layer of the deception had not yet been revealed. The most critical link in the double agent network was a man the Germans knew as Arabel and the British knew as Garbo, a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, who had first offered his services to the Germans and been accepted, then approached British intelligence in 1941. With MI5's assistance, Pujol constructed a network of 27 entirely fictional sub-agents across Britain, none of whom existed anywhere except on paper and in the Abwehr's files. Through this network, he fed German intelligence a continuous stream of credible but carefully controlled reporting. The result? By the spring of 1944, the Abwehr had awarded Pujol the Iron Cross for the quality of his intelligence product. The enemy was decorating its own double agent. June 6, 1944. The real landings came at Normandy. Within hours, the German High Command faced a question that would decide the war. Was this the main Allied effort, or was it a feint designed to pull the Panzer reserves away from Pas-de-Calais before FUSAG delivered the real blow? Rommel requested permission to move the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzerlehr Division forward to the Normandy beachhead. Hitler refused. The bridgehead was still fragile. An armored counterattack could have changed everything. But those critical reserves were held back, pending clarification of FUSAG's intentions. On June 9th, Garbo made his move. He transmitted a message to the Abwehr that reached German High Command within hours. Normandy was a diversionary operation. FUSAG's main assault on Pas-de-Calais was still imminent. German intelligence endorsed the assessment without hesitation. Hitler ordered the Panzer reserves to hold their positions. The 15th Army remained at full strength at Pas-de-Calais, waiting, for 7 weeks, motionless, watching a coastline where the only thing moving was the water. In those 7 weeks, the Allied bridgehead at Normandy expanded to a point that made it essentially irreversible. The 150,000 men who had crossed the Channel on June 6th had become more than 1 million. The liberation of France could no longer be stopped. The canvas landing craft in the Thames estuary had done their work. An army that had never existed had held in place, through the most consequential weeks of the European war, a German army that very much did. And the world would not know the full story for decades.